We discussed last week the definition of work. So we go to the first law today. But before we discuss the first law, we have to define what is internal energy and what is heat. Okay, so let's do that first. So let's take a system which is comprising a hydrostatic fluid and a resistor enclosed by adiabatic walls. So you say there's a system that looks like this. Okay, what's the system? The liquid and the resistor. Okay, and there is a surrounding adiabatic wall. And always remember that when you talk of work, you're talking of external work. That is to say, work done that will cause change in position or configuration of an external mechanical device. In this case, you are changing the position of this mass on a pulley. Okay, so whatever work is done will result in a measurable change in the position of this mass. It will go up or down. Okay. So let's say I am having an initial state with pressure Pi, temperature Ti. Okay, and let us say resistance is constant. And final state is pressure Pf, temperature Tf. Okay, so I can go along different paths now. So I can go directly, that means I can keep the pressure fixed at 1 atmosphere and vary the temperature. How? By passing current through this resistor, right? So that will heat up. I shouldn't use the word heat really, but okay. There's a way to change the temperature of this system from Ti to Tf because I haven't defined heat yet. But there's a way to change the temperature from Ti to Tf by passing current through this resistor. You could go along another path. You could go along some path so that temperature is reduced. Okay, so the pressure will go down. Then you'll go along this path. That means again some other constant value of pressure, and then you increase the pressure further. Increase the temperature further. So you can in principle go from state I to state F along infinite paths, right? Infinite number of paths. Now if you do this experiment, I mean, okay, this is more of a thought experiment, but suppose you do it along 10 paths from I to F, you will find experimentally that the work done between the state I and state F is independent of the path. Now that's not something you've seen because last week I said that the work done is path dependent, right? But in this case, you are doing what is called adiabatic work, or if you like, system is enclosed by adiabatic walls. So we'll call it adiabatic work. Now experimentally, you find that the work done is path independent if it's adiabatic. That's why I call it adiabatic work. Now we know from mechanics that if you are going from point 1 to point 2 and it is path independent, then the work done is change of potential energy in mechanics. So this motivates the definition of internal energy, which is, if you like, a thermodynamic potential energy, if you want to use other words. So I can say that adiabatic work, therefore, is the difference of a function. There exists a function called the internal energy, whose difference uf minus ui is the work done between point I and point F, independent of path. This is purely an experimental finding. Okay, remember, I'm not talking of work, I'm talking of adiabatic work. That is to say, work done when the system is enclosed by an adiabatic wall. Okay, so this, if you like, motivates the definition of internal energy. You can think of it as a thermodynamic version of potential energy. Okay, so we come to the point, what is heat then? You have some idea of heat from earlier classes, but I want to give a precise definition of heat because that will directly lead to the first law of thermodynamics. Okay, so I need to define heat precisely. All right, so let's do that. So okay, so what we did in the previous slide was we were discussing adiabatic work, right? So work done, adiabatic work is the difference in the internal energy. Now let me do a different experiment, which looks like this. Now the system is a gas and the walls are adiabatic, but not completely. One of the walls is diathermal. And you put a Bunsen burner below. So what will happen is this gas will heat up, again, I have used the word heat, but you know what will happen? This gas will expand and it will push this. It will do some measurable change in position, which is the position of this mass will change. Now, I can't call this adiabatic work because, of course, one of the walls is not adiabatic but diathermal. So let me call it diathermic work, which I'll use a symbol W. Okay. Now, what is the connection between what is on the right and what is on the left and what is on the right? The point I'm making is these may be different experiments. Of course, they are different experiments. In one case, you have something surrounded by adiabatic walls. In one case, you have a wall that is diathermal, or all walls are diathermic. Doesn't matter. Basically, all walls are not adiabatic. The point is, these two have one thing in common, that is they are the same initial and final state. I'm ensuring that. Okay, so I'm not comparing two completely different experiments. They are different, but there is one thing that's common, that in both the experiments, the initial state and the final state is the same. The path, of course, is not the same, because in one case I'm having adiabatic work, in one case I'm having diathermic work. Now, experimentally, you understand that you are doing this. If I draw it on a PT diagram, you are starting from some initial I and you're going to the final state F. The path is different in the two experiments, but you will also find that when you calculate the work done, it's not the same. That means you'll find this W is not the same as UF minus UI. Okay, so that motivates something. What is the difference in the two? Difference in what? Difference in the adiabatic work and the diathermic work. There is some offset. There is something left out. That something left out is what you call heat. So this is the formal way to get heat in thermodynamics. First time. Note one thing. So far I have not used the word temperature. I didn't say anything about temperature. Heat is defined here purely as a difference in energies. Which energies? Or work done. The adiabatic work done and the diathermic work done. That's how heat enters into thermodynamics. Temperature comes later. Okay, so don't think of it in terms of temperature. Right, so this is heat. This is the definition of heat. And of course, if the process was infinitesimal, then I would write du is dq plus dw. And that is nothing but your first law of thermodynamics for a closed system. Closed meaning control mass system. So you're not allowing exchange of matter through the system. I mean, you're not allowing something flowing in and out. The system here is enclosed, as it was enclosed in this case also. If you have an open system, you will have extra terms here. So I'm not discussing that. We'll discuss open system later. So this is the, and one more thing, remember my convention. dW is the work done on the system. That's my convention always. So this is the first law of thermodynamics in infinitesimal differentials, in terms of infinitesimal processes. Is that clear? So it is nothing but conservation of energy. After all, you're just saying that whatever was left out, I am calling another energy Q. So it just says that energy is conserved. That is all it says. Okay. But there are many things to worry about when you write things carefully, which you did not worry about earlier, because of course you have studied first law of thermodynamics earlier, but you didn't worry about many issues. First thing, you see, I have been careful about notation. You can see dq bar or d bar q and d bar w. And then it's not d bar u, because you find, we know that work is this diathermic work is path dependent. Okay, and since this is path dependent, q is also path dependent. but du is not path dependent. Du is internal energy is path independent. It's like a potential energy, right? Thermodynamic potential energy. So you see the importance now of being careful about the notation, because in Sontag this notation is not used. As I said, sometimes he uses small delta instead of d bar, or sometimes it doesn't use anything. He just writes it in terms of dq and dw without mentioning this bar symbol. It is very important to keep the notation correct. And how do you understand this statement? This statement is to be understood as what is on the right hand side. This is a small number, maybe say 10 raised to minus 10 joules. What is dw bar? Again, some very small number, 10 raised to minus 10, 20, whatever you like. So what you have on the right hand side is a small number. It's not a function of thermodynamic coordinates. You will never see heat written as a function of P and B, or work written as a function of P and B, because these are not thermodynamic coordinates. This is just indicating a small number. However, what is on the left hand side is a function of thermodynamic coordinates. So internal energy is a function of, say, temperature and volume. You understand? So you understand the importance now of keeping the notation. Suppose I remove this bar symbol, we'll immediately say, oh, this is some function of PV, this is some function of PV, and this is also some function of PV. That's not the case. What is on the right hand side is merely a small number in a process, depends on the process. And what is on the right hand side is a function of thermodynamic coordinates of the system. So it is critical to keep the notation correct throughout the thermodynamics. Otherwise, it will be really confusing. As I've written here, if the infinitesimal process is quasi-static, I defined quasi-static last class, then du dw bar can be expressed in thermodynamic coordinates, in terms of thermodynamic coordinates. Okay, what I mean is, if you're writing dw bar as, say, minus integral minus pdv, right? You're writing it as minus pdv. Then you can do that provided p is defined and v is defined, right? I mean, if pressure isn't defined, then you can't really write dw bar as minus pdv. So this law as given over here is true for any infinitesimal process. But if you want to take the next step and say that, okay, now I want to write dw bar as minus pdv, it means you are assuming the process is also quasi-static. Quasi-static means from one step of the process to the next step of the process, a system is always in thermodynamic equilibrium, so that you can use thermodynamic coordinates such as pressure and volume. Okay, so remember that if you are in practice, if you are going to use this law, you will have to assume that the process is quasi-static. We will do processes that are non-quasi-static later, but for now you have to assume that. Otherwise, how will you use this? So this is true irrespective of if the process is quasi-static or non-quasi-static. This is just the conservation of energy. It's always true. But if you want to use it in practice, that is to say, you want to relate these, you want to write this in terms of pressure, volume, temperature, so on, then the process has to be quasi-static. Because if the process is not quasi-static, then the pressure is not defined. So what is the meaning of writing PdV? Okay. Of course, if you have a cyclic process, then integral over a cycle is 0, because du is path independent. So you automatically get dq is minus dw if the process is cyclic. Okay. So this is how heat enters into thermodynamics. Okay. It comes in literally as an offset. I mean, what is left out? You've done an experiment starting from one initial state and going to a final state, but your walls are not adiabatic, meaning one of the walls or more than one of the walls is diathermic. You calculate the work done. This is an experiment you can do in the lab. We'll call it diathermic work because the wall is diathermal. You do another experiment, maybe completely different from this, but the common thing is they have the same initial and final state. Now you find that the work done is independent of the path, and therefore that motivates the definition of an internal energy. But this work adiabatic is not the same as this work diathermic. That means something is left out, right? I'm going from one process, one state to another state. Right? So what, something is left out, some energy is left out. That energy is exactly what you will call heat. So heat is in common parlance energy in transit. It's not that you can say that here is this object and the heat in the object is 4 joules. That doesn't make any sense. Does not make any sense. Or you can say the work in the object is 4 joules. That also doesn't make any sense. Because work and heat is energy in transit between the system and the surrounding. Okay, so there's no point asking what is the work in the system or what is the heat in the system. That makes no sense. Heat is transit of energy between system and surroundings. But you can ask the question, what is the internal energy of the system? Because internal energy is a function of thermodynamic coordinates, TVP of the system. So you can certainly ask that I've got this block of copper, what is the internal energy? Given the temperature, volume, pressure, whatever, or hydrostatic system, and I ask what is the internal energy, then you say, okay, tell me the temperature and volume, I'll tell you what the internal energy is. Okay, so there is a critical difference between U, Q and W. And of course, the other thing is that work is path dependent, this diathermic work, and that if this is path dependent, clearly Q is also path dependent because you're defining it in terms of path dependent function. But du is not path dependent, du is path independent. Okay. Now let's look at another way of defining heat in just plain English. If I write it down, when a closed system whose surroundings are at a different temperature, or temperature enters in, and on which diathermic work may be done, undergoes a process, the energy transferred by non-mechanical means is called heat. Okay. So the reason why temperature is now entering in here is because remember the wall is diathermal. So you can have remember the definition of diathermal wall and adiabatic wall, right? Diathermal wall means at equilibrium the surroundings and the system will be having the same thermodynamic coordinate. Will have restricted thermodynamic coordinates for a diathermal wall. For an adiabatic wall, the coordinates of the system and the surroundings can be arbitrary, assuming the wall is not broken up. We are still assuming the wall is there. So that was the definition of adiabatic wall and diathermal wall in the first class. Okay, so basically, if there is a difference in temperature, then there is a transit of energy between the system and the surrounding. Basically, diathermic work will be done, and this energy transferred by non-mechanical means is called heat. Okay. Now, note that unlike internal, as I said, unlike internal energy, heat is not a function of thermodynamic state of the system. Okay, you cannot write heat as a function of P and V because heat is basically energy in transit. It is not a property of the system. It is a property of, if you like, the interaction between the system and the surrounding. Internal energy is a property of the system because it is a function of the thermodynamic coordinates of the state. Now the sign convention we will use is simple. The heat is positive when heat enters the system and negative when heat leaves the system. Now the good thing is this sign convention is universal in thermodynamics. Remember, the sign convention for work is not universal. The sign convention for heat is universal. Whenever you find heat positive, that means heat is entering a system, and heat negative means heat is leaving a system. What is the first law in Sontag? There is a difference. There are two differences from what I have stated given on my slide. Okay, so in Sontag the law is written in this way. Actually, I am giving more credit to Sontag than what is written over here, because you can see I have written here d bar q minus d bar w. He doesn't even write it this way. He writes as dq minus dw. Does not use the bar symbol, which is a grave error because it is then confusing to the reader whether this is an exact differential or inexact differential. Right? This is inexact differential. But there is one more difference. So there are two differences. One is there's a negative sign here, because Sontag considers work done by the system. Szymanski considers work done on the system. So depends on what convention you want to use. Second thing, you see the left hand side in Szymanski is just du is dq plus dw. But in Sontag, it's slightly differentiates it by writing it in the following way. What Sontag says is, suppose a system has some center of mass which is moving, then there will be some bulk kinetic energy for the system, and there will be some change in potential energy, and whatever else is there is what he calls du. So, I mean, this kind of splitting is really a bit artificial because you just have actually du here. But for engineering kind of problems, this kind of splitting is done. So I'm just stating it, what is given in the book. But most of the times I won't really need to do this splitting, but sometimes you need to do it. If you're given, for example, that some, like nozzle or something is moving in the liquid, then you will need to separate out the kinetic energy of the center of mass and the potential energy, if any, if there is any. And then there's the other things, which is the internal energy. So he calls it dE. That's a symbol used in Sontag. Okay. And of course, other differences, there's a minus sign here instead of a plus sign. You have to be comfortable with both the sign conventions for work. For heat, the sign convention in all books is universal, which is as given here. Okay, so let's take an example. I have a hydrostatic system. So internal energy is some function of, say, T and V are my variables. Then I can write dq is du plus pdv, right? You understand, du is dq minus pdv. So I'm placing the pdv on the other side, because dw is minus pdv. So it's coming on the other side, becoming plus pdv. So I can write du as an exact differential. So I will write it out, plug it in, and I'll get this relation for dq. So what happens at constant volume? The second term is 0, and I get dq by dt at constant volume is del u by del t at constant volume. So what is the use of this relation? Firstly, this is nothing but your specific heat, constant volume. Unit is joule per Kelvin. Now, what is the use of this? See, experimentally, you can measure this because you can find the heat, right? We just did that, right? How do you find the heat? You do the diathermic work and the adiabatic work, and you subtract it, you will get the heat. And you can, of course, find the change in temperature, keeping volume fixed. So this side is experimentally, you can certainly find out. What is on the right hand side is not experimentally measurable. You will have a theory, some kind of microscopic theory for the system that will make a prediction of internal energy. So I will take that prediction, differentiate with respect to T, keeping volume constant, and I will then compare the result of the theory with the experiment. So this gives you a means of directly comparing the results of experiment with what comes out from some theory for the material, whatever material it is. I have some theory which predicts internal energy, and I need to verify whether the theory makes sense. Then I will differentiate the internal energy from the theory for the given volume, calculate this side, and then compare it with the experiment. So the measurement of specific heat is a very important measurement in thermodynamics because it allows you to compare the result of experiment with theory. Now, again, keep that in mind. What is dq by dt? As I said, it is not a derivative of a function. It looks like that. It looks like I'm differentiating the function q. No, this is to be understood as a ratio of two small numbers, very small numbers. Okay, the ratio of two very small numbers is some finite number, which is CV. This is an experimentally measured number, small differential of heat, and this is an experimentally measured number, a small difference in temperature. I'm dividing the two and getting another number, CV. Right? And what is on the right hand side? It's a function, u as a function of TV. Right? You understand the whole point I'm making about notation? Suppose I wrote like this, CV equal to dq by dt. What would you say? Oh, actually I have something like this. Let us differentiate it now. No, that doesn't make any sense because this is not a function of coordinates. This is a ratio of two small numbers, dq and dt. So notation is very important in thermodynamics. Now, the usual thing that we want to look at is not the specific heat, but the molar heat capacity, or the molar specific heat, molar heat capacity. That's the correct one. For n moles, you simply divide out dq by dt with n. So your unit is joule per mole Kelvin. That's the molar heat capacity. Of course, you can define the molar heat capacity at constant pressure and at constant volume. And as you know from earlier study, that the ratio is some gamma, ratio of specific heats, right? Now here is a table of values of gamma for low pressures. That means I'm looking at dilute gases. Okay. For monoatomic gas, hydrogen, helium, not hydrogen. Hydrogen is a diatomic gas. Helium, neon, argon, sodium vapor. These are all monoatomic gases. Gamma is 5/3. I would suggest you just memorize these numbers because they are used all the time in problems. And diatomic gas, for example, air is basically nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen, carbon monoxide. That will give you gamma of 7/5. If you take polyatomic gases such as steam, H2O, or methane, ammonia, etc., around 1.3. Okay. Now, you can explain this. I mean, this is, although I'm saying you're memorizing it, but you can of course explain the value of gamma. So let's look at the temperature dependence of Cp, for example, for hydrogen. So if you, firstly, this Cp is a function of temperature. Cv is also a function of temperature, and as is gamma a function of temperature. So let's look at temperature dependence of Cp for hydrogen. And what I plotted on the y-axis is Cp by R, and on the x-axis is the temperature. If you have low temperatures, then only the translation degrees of freedom are active. So if you have a hydrogen molecule, think of it as two beads and a spring in between, right? Just H2, H atom, and there is a spring connecting them. Think of it that way. So at low temperatures, what can happen is you can have translation. It will translate. So you have 3 degrees of translation, degrees of freedom of translation. So the Cp by R is the number of degrees of freedom by 2 plus 1. So you have 3/2 plus 1, that's 5/2. So you can see the Cp by R is 5/2. As you increase the temperature, what happens? The hydrogen molecule can also rotate now, right? Start rotating. So you will have a theta and phi. So now you have 5 degrees of freedom. So your Cp by R rises to 7/2. If you further increase it, temperature goes to like 5000 Kelvin or something, then it also starts vibrating, right? So you have 2 more degrees of freedom, which is the kinetic and the potential energy, right? So you finally have 7/2 plus 1, 9/2. So essentially your Cp value will change depending on what is the temperature. Okay, Cp is not a constant. What is given over here is Cp for low pressure values. Okay, but this value is of course, like you see, for example, take this case. It says here diatomic gas 7/5. That means your Cp was 7 by something, right? So you're talking of this rotational mode. So Cp as given in this gamma value given the table is basically pertaining to what is happening in this middle region. But I could have other values of gamma if I'm even higher temperature. Okay, so these values are not independent of temperature. These values vary with temperature. But these are the values we will typically use in problems. That's why I'm writing it in a table here. But the values of course depend on what the temperature is. The temperature will, as the temperature increases, these values will change. And of course I've written that for the case of low pressure, that means we are taking a dilute gas. If you have a dense gas, then these values will again change. So just remember that. But anyway, for problems purposive problems, these values are all you need to remember. Or it might be given as a information in the problem. Now, there's another empirical law which is quite useful, which is the Dulong-Petit law, which is useful for crystalline solids at high temperatures. Okay, so I'm plotting on the y-axis CV by 3R, and on the x-axis the temperature. And I'm taking some examples of crystalline solids. For example, diamond, sodium chloride, crystal, right? Magnesium oxide, so on. You can see something interesting in all these graphs, that at high enough temperature, all these graphs are approaching CV by 3R equal to 1. That means CV is approaching 3R. Diamond, what happened is I need to go to even higher temperature to approach 3R. So that CV approaches 3R. So you can ask the question, why is it that at high temperature, all the crystalline solids have the same value of CV, which is 3R? And you can see that quite easily, because your internal energy will be basically half kBT for each degree of freedom times the Avogadro number, because we are looking at molar internal energy here. Small symbol indicates molar, okay? A molar version of internal energy. This is molar specific heat. Times 6. Why 6? Because you will have 3 vibrational degrees. You'll be in the vibrational domain. So you will have 3 in 3 dimensions. You will have kinetic energy components, 3 of them, right? Half mvx square, half mvy square, half mvz square, and you will have 3 potential energy components. I shouldn't use the word components, but 3 scalar quantities, basically half kx square, y square, z square. So you will have 6 degrees of freedom. Therefore, that gives you 3 RT, where R is the universal gas constant, which is defined as Na times Kb. Boltzmann constant times Avogadro number, right? This is 6 into 10 raised to 23, your Avogadro number, and Kb is 1.38 10 raised to minus 23. So this is of order unity, basically, right? Universal gas constant has a value of 8.314 joule per Kelvin. Okay, so the point of this is, if I calculate CV as the derivative of del U by del T at constant V, it is 3R, which you can see is basically 8 into 3, 24, roughly 25 joules per mole Kelvin. This is the molar specific heat at constant volume. So what I'm trying to say is, nearly all crystalline solids at high temperatures will show a CV of 25 joule per mole Kelvin. So this was an experimental finding well before statistical mechanics was properly developed. So this is sometime in the last part of the 19th century. Dulong and Petit found this interesting pattern, that for crystalline solids at high enough temperatures, the specific heat CV was always 25 joule per mole Kelvin. So people are wondering, why is it? How can all these materials are very different, right? Diamond is very different from magnesium oxide, is very different from sodium chloride, but they all asymptote to the same value, which is 3R. And you can explain that today by some simple kind of argument like this. Okay, so this is just one other empirical law which is quite useful and you should know about it. Okay. Now I need to define the concept of heat reservoir, which I have defined here. So let's look at that. A body of such a large mass that it may absorb or reject an unlimited quantity of heat with no appreciable change in any thermodynamic coordinate. Okay, so what is the example of heat reservoir? For example, the ocean. If I take an ice cube and throw it into the ocean, what is the change in the temperature of the ocean? It's not zero, but it's negligibly small. So I can say the ocean is a heat reservoir for the ice cube, because when I throw the ice cube in, there is a virtually negligible change in the temperature of the ocean. Same for atmospheric air, right? If you heat up some milk You can ask the temperature, what is the change in temperature of the air? There is a change in temperature, but it's negligible. So we have idealizations and we have an approximation of a heat reservoir. These are approximations of a heat reservoir. Now, why am I defining this heat reservoir? Two things to remember. One is any quasi-static process of a system in contact with a heat reservoir is isothermal, not adiabatic, it's isothermal. That means if I'm doing any process where there is exchange of heat between my system and the surrounding is a heat reservoir, then this process is isothermal. At which temperature? At the temperature of the reservoir. Essentially, you can think of it as, I'll give you an example from other branch of physics. You can think of it as an electrical ground, right? What happens in electricity and electricity? When you study electricity, what happens? You say that the ground can basically suck up any number of electrons. Right? You shoot electrons, it will just swallow it, right? So it's basically the lowest potential. So everything will go from a high potential, the charges will flow down to the ground. So the ground, electrical ground, is very much like a heat reservoir. It can absorb and give out any amount of heat. So if you have some difference in temperature, what will happen eventually? Well, of course, the temperature of the system and the surrounding will become the same at equilibrium. And what is that same temperature? Temperature of the reservoir. Okay, so any quasi-static process, remember the word quasi-static, quasi-static process of a system in contact with a heat reservoir is isothermal because the temperature is constant. Which temperature? Temperature of the reservoir. So that's one point. The second point is why we introduce heat reservoir. Okay, suppose I say here's a pen and I'm heating up this pen by putting a Bunsen burner on it, right? So you will say that, okay, temperature of the pen is say 30 degrees or say 40 degrees and temperature of the atmosphere is 25 degrees. So what will happen? You say at equilibrium, it will come to the temperature of the air, because as I said, the air is an approximate heat reservoir. But there's a problem now. The temperature of the pen is 40 degrees and the temperature of the air is 25 degrees. That's a finite difference in temperature. How are you going to go from 40 to 25? It's a finite change in temperature, right? What you are really saying, if you want to use thermodynamics for this process, is you have your pen at 25 degrees, sorry, at 40 degrees. I will bring a reservoir from somewhere and put it in contact with the pen. The reservoir temperature is 25 degrees plus epsilon. Say 25.5 degrees. So what will happen to the pen? At equilibrium, the pen will come to a temperature of 25.5 degrees. Then I'll do another experiment. I'll bring a reservoir of temperature 30 degrees. Put it in contact with the pen. The temperature will increase now from 25.5 to 30. This is the meaning of going from 25 to 40 degrees. You will go through infinite number of heat reservoirs with an infinitesimal change in temperature from 25 degrees, ranging from 25 degrees to 40 degrees. If you do this process this way, it's quasi-static and you can use thermodynamics. The thermodynamics that we are studying. Let me read out. To describe quasi-static flow of heat involving change of temperature from Ti to Tf, we imagine, or we think of a thought experiment, a series of reservoirs ranging in temperature from Ti to Tf, placed successively in contact with the system, such that difference in temperature is infinitesimal at any step of the process. Exactly what I described. Right? So it's not going to go from 25 to 40 instantly. I mean, it's not that at one step of the process is 25, from 40 to 25, the other way. The pen is at 40 degrees and the pen will then very next step go to 25 degrees. If you do that thing, process is not quasi-static. So things like pressure, volume, temperature are not even defined as far as classical thermodynamics is concerned. But if you do the process the way I'm describing it, which is you start with the pen at 40 degrees and you reduce the temperature slowly and bring it down to 25, infinitesimal infinitesimally every time, an infinite number of such steps, always keeping in touch with the heat reservoir. Then you will ensure that the process is quasi-static, and therefore your formalism and all the other things will actually work. So this is the understanding. This is the reason why I'm introducing the concept of heat reservoir, because it is implicit in all the problems, right? So you might see all kinds of finite temperature differences. I mean, in any realistic situation, there is a finite difference of temperature between the system and the surrounding. But if you are going to take the system to the temperature of the surrounding, you have to do it in infinite number of infinitesimal steps to ensure that the process is quasi-static, if you want to use all this formalism. So remember that. Okay. Now, there is some discussion of heat modes of heat transfer, and I'm not going to do it in detail for the reason that there is a whole course on heat transfer next semester where all this will be done over the entire semester. So I've only given a very brief, the basic formulae only. You don't need to worry too much about heat transfer because this is a separate course. But I've given the basic formula for conduction, convection, and radiation essentially. So I'll just run through it. For conduction, you have Fourier's law, which is heat flux Q defined to be your dq by dt. Note one thing, something funny over here. Time is entered in. And I have to explain now on what condition I can write something like this. Okay, immediate confusion, because we know that thermodynamic coordinates don't depend on time. So why are you writing time over here? So I have to explain what this actually means physically. I will do that. But right now, just take this result. It says that the heat dq by dt, T is time, by per unit area, is proportional to the temperature gradient. And the constant of proportionality is the thermal conductivity, which is in general a function of temperature. Why the negative sign? Because you know that heat flows from higher temperatures to lower temperatures. Okay, so if the gradient is from high to low, then this will be positive. So that there will be positive flow of heat. In 3 dimensions, you can generalize this and write a heat flux vector, which is minus k times the gradient of the temperature. Here is just the derivative, single derivative. Here it's a gradient. And k is the thermal conductivity. Right? So this is heat flowing in the perpendicular direction. So this is some element, area element of thickness Tx. One face is at temperature T, the other face is at temperature T plus dt, and heat is flowing normal to the face. So what is the heat flux? The heat flowing per unit time per unit area. That is minus k times derivative of temperature, change in temperature. Okay. Again, I'm not going to the details of conduction, convection, and radiation, because this is an independent course at least in mechanical engineering, this is an independent course. So you will do that. What about convection? You have Newton's law of cooling, which says that the heat flux is a constant multiple of the difference in temperature between the wall and the fluid. Okay, so there's a wall here and there's a fluid and there's a difference in temperature. That is, the constant of proportionality is the convection coefficient. Note the units are different. This is watts per meter Kelvin. This is watt per meter square Kelvin. And in practice, what you have is a thermal boundary layer between the fluid and the wall, because you have to have a variation in temperature, right, from TW to T fluid. So there is a gradient here. So that's what's called a thermal boundary layer. And this H is like a composite coefficient which also takes into account the thermal boundary layer. These details will be studied in next semester, so don't worry about it. Just remember the basic formula, which just says heat flux is proportional to difference in temperature between the wall and the fluid. And there's some constant of proportionality called the convection coefficient. Here you had thermal conductivity. And you also have radiation. When I say radiation, I'm talking of thermal radiation. That means wavelength 700 nanometers to 1 mm infrared. Beyond 1 mm will be infrared. So this is the range of 700 nanometers to 1. This is not visible light, right? Visible light is between 400 and 700 nanometers. This is beyond visible light. So this is infrared. 700 nanometers to 1 mm is the region of thermal radiation. In thermodynamics, we are not concerned with radiation in the entire spectrum. We are not concerned about visible light, for example. You will consider that in optics. But in thermodynamics, we are concerned with thermal radiation. That means infrared. So that is between 700 and 700 nanometers and 1 mm wavelength. And for that, you have your, if you remember, Stephen Boltzmann's law, right? Sigma T raised to 4. Basically, the heat flux is proportional to sigma T raised to 4. What is this? This is TW is a wall. There's a cavity, okay, in which there is an object. The walls of the cavity are at temperature TW, and the temperature is and the object is at temperature T. The object is in the cavity. So you will get your Stephen Boltzmann's law, sigma T raised to 4. Sigma is the Stephen Boltzmann constant, and epsilon is the emissivity, which is also a function of temperature in general. Okay, sigma is not a function of temperature. Sigma is a constant, just a constant. But emissivity is a function of temperature. So this is the heat flux for a non-black body at temperature T in a cavity with walls at temperature TW. Okay, so you have some object at temperature T, which is not a black body, which is kept inside a cavity. The cavity walls have temperature TW. Then the heat flux between the object and the wall is given by this expression, which you may have studied. I am sure you have studied this sigma T raised to 4 in previous classes. But the heat flux is to be calculated. That is just a constant times, emissivity, which is a function of temperature in general, times sigma T raised to 4. Okay, so I will not go into details of this part, modes of heat transfer. This is deliberately given briefly because you will spend an entire semester on. So in the next semester, you will discuss conduction and convection in detail. I don't think radiation is discussed in detail. There is no course on radiation. Because there are a lot of issues there which can be discussed. But primarily the course heat transfer will concern conduction and convection in great detail. So you need to know only the basic formula in this course. You don't need to worry about all the details. Any questions so far? I have one additional comment and then we will stop. About first law. Yeah, let's discuss that and then we will continue on Friday. So let's look at the other thing from Sontag, which is something very important to know. Okay. So I have extracted this paragraph from Sontag, page 141. You can take a look. I just copy pasted. So remember that we wrote down the first law. How does Sontag write the law? dE is equal to dQ minus dW. That's the first law. But there is a section here, 5.8, which is saying first law is a rate equation. Okay, so let's read out what it is. He says, in so doing, so he says, we frequently find it desirable to use the first law as a rate equation. So basically he's saying you have a derivative with respect to time, right? What is the first law? dE equal to dQ minus dW. He's saying, okay, differentiate both sides with respect to time. So the law will look like this. This is what Sontag writes. dE by dt is Q dot minus W dot, right? Now he writes here, in so doing, we are departing from strictly classical point of view because basically classical thermodynamics deals with systems that are in equilibrium. And time is not a relevant parameter for systems that are in equilibrium. I said that. Thermodynamic coordinates do not involve the time. So what gives you the right to start differentiating with respect to time? If you are saying that heat and internal energy and all that is not a function of time, then what do you mean by differentiating and writing a rate process like this? right? That's a source of confusion. But what is the logic given by Sontag? However, since these rate equations are developed from the concepts of classical thermodynamics and used in many applications of thermodynamics, they are included in this book. Right? That's utterly stupid. That's like saying everybody is copying in the tests, so I will also copy in the test. Is that logic meaningful, or is that logic faulty? Okay, it is completely pointless logic here. So let me tell you on what condition this is true, which Sontag doesn't mention anywhere in the book. So remember what I said. First law is useful for system in thermal equilibrium, right? So what you are trying to say when you're using this equation is, this equation is okay, provided the time scale that you are worried about is much larger than the equilibration time of the system. So any process you do will have some equilibration time, which is decided by the internal properties of the system and the surrounding. Let's call that tau EQ, the equilibration time. Now you are doing the process over some time t. If that time t is long, large, much larger than the equilibration time, then your system will remain basically at equilibrium, right? Because you are doing your process over 1 hour, but the system takes only 1 second to equilibrate. Then it's as good as saying system is at equilibrium, even though it's varying. It will equilibrate, but your process takes 1 hour. So then it is okay as an approximation to write a rate equation like this. Another way of looking at it is the rate of the process is much less than the equilibration rate. This is the same thing written in different words. So if the process is quickly equilibrating, that means the rate of equilibration is high. Then basically system is going to remain in equilibrium throughout the process. In that case, it is reasonable to use a rate equation, but not this kind of lame excuse. However, since these rate equations are developed from the concepts of classical thermodynamics and are used in many applications, we will write it this way. That's not the logic of any, that makes any sense. You have to justify that if time is not an important, as he writes here, right here, he himself writes, time is not a relevant parameter. Okay, if time is not a relevant parameter, then why are you considering it? You can consider it, provided the time of interest is much larger than the time taken for the system to equilibrate. If that's the case, then it's fine. I hope that is clear, this last point, because it is not explained in any sense in Sontag. It is used, this kind of expression is used all the time, rate equations, okay? But under what condition is the rate equation meaningful? That is not discussed. I hope that is clear in what I so far what I have said. Okay. Any questions? We continue on Friday. Sir.